Welcome to today's video. It's Eileen at Through the Garden Gate, and today's topic is we're going to talk a little bit about native versus non-native plants, what the difference is, and does it really matter? I've already given you the spoiler alert. Yes, it does, depending on what your gardening goals are. So let's start by just talking a little bit about what are the differences between native plants. So when we talk about native plants, these are the plants that have been growing in a particular geographic location for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They've evolved in that location. They've evolved to the and adapted to the local climate. They've evolved with wildlife, from the teeniest, tiniest little insects and pollinators on up to larger browsing animals. So they've have this really tight interdependent relationship with the wildlife, and that comes through in the dependence a lot of plants have on pollinators to help with pollination. The wildlife that depends on these plants for food, of course, is really critically important. And over time, they've evolved some defenses against over browsing by insects or deer or in some cases rabbits. Though as much as we'd like to say things are deer and rabbit proof in the gardening world, when we talk about natives, I often like to say that they're deer resistant or rabbit resistant. I suppose if a deer or a rabbit is hungry enough, they may nibble on something, just about any plant, to taste it at least, to see. And then really importantly for some of our landscaping goals and maybe some challenges for a changing climate is that for at least where I'm at in my neck of the woods in the Midwest here, our native plants, once they get established, really don't need a whole lot of attention as far as watering or dealing with pest issues. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And along the way, I'm just sharing some photos of some of our native plants found here in the upper Midwest. We've got the common milkweed over there with the caterpillar on it, with the monarch caterpillar. Top middle is bee balm or Monarda fistulosa. Marsh marigold is up on the top right, and then some bluebells and beautiful white trillium on the bottom. Native plants have a lot of benefits. I talked just a second ago about, that important role they play in supporting local wildlife, and that they're so well adapted to our climate. And one of those adaptations that really help them to do well in where they live, and especially here in the Midwest. This is a diagram that you see all over the place when people talk about native plants. These are some native prairie species, plants that you can find in a prairie. So they do really well in full sun and places where you have a hot, dry summer. And they have very deep, extensive root systems. And those root systems go way down into the ground. And not only do they help the plant absorb water from the soil and bring water into the plant, but as plants grow, in order for them to grow, they have to go through photosynthesis, which is taking carbon the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, combines with water in their leaves. You get that energy boost from the sun. The green color of chlorophyll helps play a major role. That all mixes up in the leaf and it creates the food that the plant needs to grow. And that food is glucose. And there's carbon in glucose. And so every part of a plant stores carbon. And when you get really deep, extensive root systems, you're storing a lot of that carbon down in the soil, you're pulling it out of the atmosphere, and you're sequestering it or holding it in the plant tissues and underground. Those root systems also open up deep channels that allows water to absorb down into the soil. And the organic matter that those roots, as they decompose, a certain part, as the plant grows, some roots will die, new ones will grow. You get a lot of really good organic matter in the soil. It allows the soil to hold more water. So when we get intense rain events, you've got a place for water to go and to be stored. And as it slowly infiltrates into the soil and into the groundwater supplies, it's getting filtered and cleaned. Now over there on the left, where the red arrow's flashing, is a typical turf grass lawn. You can see a lot of the turf grass lawns that you see across the country are non-native species that were brought from other parts of the world. They don't have as deep of a root system, and so they're not going to perform those same functions as our native plants would. And this is just a few other examples of some native plants from my garden over the years. Top row from left to right, you've got butterfly milkweed, which is Asclepias tuberosa, one of the blazing stars with some monarch butterflies visiting. Wild geranium, beautiful spring bloomer here in our area. Prairie smoke, which is a really cool, full sun, almost like a ground cover type flower with these real pretty ethereal flowers when they bloom. Mid to late spring to early summer in my area. Bottom row left to right, sneezeweed, which is a fall bloomer. Don't worry, it won't make you sneeze. But it is blooming about the time that the ragweed is pretty active in our area, and I think that's how it got its name. Next one there is pale purple coneflower. Then you've got blue-eyed grass, which is another great front of the border, shorter, just pop of really pretty flowers. I believe they're in the iris family. And then iris or lily, I can't remember. And then the last one there on the bottom row is New England aster. So just a few examples of some of our natives. So then if native plants are the ones that have been growing here, the non-native ones are the ones that haven't. And there are a lot of non-native plants that we as gardeners grow in our garden. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing necessarily. We'll talk a little bit about when those non-native plants can become a problem. But everything from your vegetables in your vegetable garden to the marigolds that you maybe plant around them, the daffodils that you see the leaves up in the top picture there in the back, tulips, just about most plants that you'll find in a big box store. So they've not evolved over time in a specific area. They've been brought here by humans and moved around. And because they didn't evolve in this area, they typically require more care from us. We have to water them more. You know, a lot of them might be annuals. They can't survive our winter, so we got to replant them every year. Maybe they're a little more susceptible to some pest damages because they haven't evolved defenses against some of the pests in our area. And so gardeners may end up using more chemical herbicides and pesticides. And a good example of that, again, is our lawns. A lot of people like those pristine, perfectly green, weed-free lawns, and that requires a lot of input because those plants haven't evolved here. They really don't do well here unless we put a lot of work into it. And as I said, not all non-natives are quote unquote bad, but some non-native species, because of some of their adaptations, can become really invasive and disrupt natural ecosystems. And for the most part, most of them are not going to really do a great job of supporting our local food webs and local wildlife. We'll talk about that coming up here. So these invasive non-natives, these are the non-native species that, because they didn't evolve here, they don't have any natural enemies or controls on them. They can be very aggressive and they can very quickly outcompete native plants where they get a little foothold in. And because of certain adaptations, for example, the European buckthorn on the left there, that, as the name suggests, came from Europe, and settlers brought it with as a natural hedgerow. That's how they used it back at home. And it wasn't obviously an intention to cause problems in our native ecosystems here. They were just coming to a new place and brought some of the plants from home with them. Buckthorn leaves out earlier in the spring, and it keeps its leaves much later in the fall. And then the berries you see there in that picture, some birds do eat those berries, and unfortunately they have a natural cathartic effect, so they don't give the bird much nutrition. they move through the bird's body very quickly, and then as birds sit on power lines or roost in trees or are just flying over when they go to the bathroom, those seeds get distributed pretty widely, and they can really get going in an area and just completely block out all sunlight and don't allow any native plants to grow. Lastly, for the buckthorn, they also emit a chemical from their root system called emodin, which is it prevents other plants from being able to germinate in that area. So it's a real mess, and it's found all over the place, especially the eastern United States. Garlic mustard is an herbaceous plant. It's not woody, but it can grow in really big, thick patches and does a similar thing. It grows up pretty early in the spring, shades out the soil, and doesn't allow sun to reach the ground, so our native plants can't germinate, can't get going. I could spend all day unfortunately talking about invasive non-native plants, but I'm just going to share two more woody species that are a real problem here in the Midwest. Japanese honeysuckle and Bradford or Callery pear. All these plants that I believe all of them are on the state of Illinois' noxious weeds list, so they should not be able to be. The honeysuckle may not be on there yet, actually. But I know the Bradford pear just got added this year to Illinois' list, but it's going to be allowed to be sold until the year 2028, so that nurseries can, get rid of the stock they have. It's a little unfortunate because the more you get these plants into the people's yards, then they can escape out into natural areas and become a real problem. But all of these form big, dense colonies that outcompete our native plants. And again, they don't have any natural disease controls or pressures from browsing from insects or anything else. So they really have a pretty unfair advantage. Just two pictures to kind of illustrate with those woody invasive plants like honeysuckle, the buckthorn. The top picture there shows a wooded, what used to be probably like an open oak hickory savanna. You can see the bigger, taller, thicker trunk trees are more widely spaced. Those are oaks, and for the most part, I think they're oaks. And then that dense sort of shrubby layer you see underneath in that top picture are all those non-native invasives. Now, this picture was taken last week, so there's no leaves on the trees, but you can imagine when that dense understory layer gets leafed out early in the spring, it's going to block all sunlight. And unfortunately, not only do we get the issue of not having native wildflowers and things like that are able to grow in that area, but it prevents baby oak trees and baby hickory trees from growing as well. So when these older trees die, there's nothing to replace them, which is a real issue in the ecosystem. Underneath that picture is not the same location, obviously, but it is an area that has some restoration work done to it to clear out that kind of shrubby understory of invasive non-natives, and it's pretty striking. I mean, they're taken at different times of the year, but one of the things that jumps out at me is I can see the whole trunk of the trees from the ground layer on up, and there is enough sunlight that gets down there that you get an herbaceous layer of native grasses and wildflowers, and maybe some native shrubs in there as well, and so it becomes a more layered, complex, diverse ecosystem. If you do have invasive non-native plant species in your yard that you want to get rid of, there's a variety of methods, and it really does depend on the species of plant. No matter where you are in the world, you could be in the United States, you could be anywhere in the world. Because of the movement of humans around our planet, we are transporting plants all over the place. And so everybody deals with some sort of non-native invasive species. And, if you go to a different part of the world, it might have been a species from North America that got shared. And the concept is the same. So you really have to do some research and figure out what non-native invasive species you have. And then what's the best way to control it? And sometimes like garlic mustard, hand pulling might be the best way to control it. For something woody like honeysuckle or buckthorn, you might need to cut the stump and then spot herbicide. And, but some people don't like using herbicides, and I'm one of them. I understand on large scale restorations, it could be necessary, or if you have a big infestation, so you just gotta, be really careful with the use. But some people have had success if you don't have a big patch of these woody non-natives. You can cut them and then cover them completely with black plastic, cover the stump completely with black plastic, and some people have had success killing it off. But if you just cut it, you're basically just making the plant angry, and it's going to come back and resprout and be even thicker in the long run. So you do got to either do that herbicide or some way to kind of kill the stump. And I would just recommend checking your local forest preserves or conservation organizations, if you have extension offices, for advice. And I'm going to put a link in the description for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, has a great resource on removing non-native invasive species. So that's a place to start. So how do I even know if a plant is native to my area? I would recommend this really great resource, BONAP's North American Plant Atlas. And I'll put a link in the description for this as well. They've got these really great maps that show you the range and, whether a plant is native, whether it's non-native and aggressive, non-native or and invasive. And this example that I pulled up here is the example for Monarda fistulosa, which is a bee balm, is a common name. And so the dark green color on the map shows that it is present and native in a state. The brown that you see in California and Florida, most of Florida there, that means it's not present in the state. And that light green means it's present and not rare. So it's pretty common. And it's a really great resource, but and it's split up by county, so you can get very specific. And that I should have said this earlier, but when we define native species to a specific geographic location, there could be a plant that's native to North America, but maybe it's not native to the state of Illinois where I live, or to the county where I live. And it's, again, just about your preferences as a gardener and what your goals are. Some people feel like, I'm going to use a native plant if it's native to North America, or I'll use it if it's native to my state. Where I live in Illinois, we're a very long state. And so the climate conditions way up in the northeast part of Illinois where I live are very different from the climate conditions down in the south. So you get different plant communities, but you can see some species like this Monarda, they're very adaptable and they can be found in a lot of different areas. So that could be a decision you make too. And for me, my personal gardening goals, I like to try and only use plants that are native to my county. And in future videos, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I try to get pretty specific about, okay, what do I think the habitat was here in my neighborhood before all the houses were built? And I try to hone in on that, because the more specific you can be, you're going to have better success at getting these plants to establish, because they do have, they do grow in certain conditions better than others, depending on the species of plant. I think it's important to talk about the difference between a straight native species and a cultivar. Cultivars are just plants that have been modified by humans. They are bred for certain selected traits, usually because it's something that appeals to us. We want a brighter pink, or we want the plant to be shorter, or we want the plant to be taller, or we want it to be more disease resistant. And straight native species have not been bred by humans. They've evolved naturally in their environment, and the things that shaped their evolution were things like weather and climate and interactions with animal species. And it can be sometimes confusing because you'll go to a nursery or a garden center and you'll say, oh, look, there's a purple coneflower or an echinacea. And but it's a cultivar, and it may have been manipulated or changed in a way that doesn't make it suitable for supporting wildlife, and your goal might be to support wildlife. So one of the best things you can do is read your labels, and a plant label that's got the scientific name, but it also has another name, the common name, and then another name, maybe in quotations. You know, it could be a type of phlox, and it'll say, you know, I can't read the card right now when I'm looking at my own presentation. Glamour Grill. So those little extra names like, you know, Pink Surprise or things like that, you know, when those little names are in quotations, that it's a cultivar. And I'm not saying that all cultivars are bad. I eat a lot of plants that are cultivars. But if your goal is to support wildlife, you just want to make sure. There is a lot of research being done at a place called the Mount Cuba Center on, you know, cultivars of native plants. Do they still support the critters? And one of the biggest things are making sure that the flower shape or color hasn't been manipulated. You know, sometimes people buy plants that are a certain variety of, and it's a double flowered variety. And essentially, you're not going to be able to support a lot of pollinators that way, because our native pollinators evolved with our native wildflowers, and their mouth structures evolved to be able to get food from those plants. And if you manipulate the plant structures, they won't be able to access the pollen or nectar. And a lot of times with cultivars, they may, because they're a cultivar and they're a clone of something else, they may not even actually produce a lot of nectar or pollen. So just, again, keep in mind what your gardening goals are. Another thing to keep in mind if you're using a cultivar of a native plant is if the leaf color has been changed. So if there's a species of native plant and there's a variety or a cultivar that now has red or purple leaves instead of green, you're not going to support the caterpillars that would normally eat that plant. And we'll talk in a slide or two about host plants and the importance of host plants. There we go. Right, next slide. Host plants are really, really important. As I mentioned earlier, our native plants co-evolved with our native animals over time, and they have these interdependent relationships. So the plants rely on the animals for pollination and seed dispersal, and animals rely on plants for food, because plants are the things that can sit out in the sun and make their own food, and they move that energy from the sun through a food web. So everything else on our planet, if you're not a plant, you have to either eat a plant or something that ate a plant in order to get energy to live. And with that kind of pressure, plants, of course, over time have evolved defenses. They don't want everything and their brother eating their leaves. They wouldn't be able to grow and reproduce themselves. So over time, they develop these sort of chemical defenses that make their leaves taste bad, or maybe they've got spines or something like that, anything like that, to help deter things from eating it. Well, animals have to eat. So over time, animals develop defenses against these plant defenses. It's almost like a little evolutionary arms race. And you can get very specific interdependent relationships. And one example of that is a monarch butterfly. Their caterpillar can only eat the leaves of our native milkweeds. If you've ever torn a milkweed leaf, you may notice it's got a thick white sap that can be toxic to a lot of animals, but monarch caterpillars have evolved to be able to tolerate and ingest those leaves. In the process, it makes them taste bad to other animals, And that's why you see those bright colors on their caterpillar and butterfly. It's sort of warning other animals that they taste bad. And most insects can only eat the plants with which they co-evolved. So without those host plants, caterpillars cannot become adult butterflies and moths. And if we don't have adult butterflies and moths, we're not going to have more caterpillars. And the vast majority of our native songbirds feed their babies insects, whether, they themselves eat something else, a berry or a seed, they're feeding their babies insects. And most of those insects that are being fed to these baby birds are caterpillars, because for the most part, they're squishy, juicy little nuggets of good nutrition. And, so it's not just about the plants you put in your garden don't just impact the insects in your garden, but they impact the entire food web. It's the base of the food web. So that's why host plants are very important. And there's a lot of other examples out there that I could, again, rattle off for hours, but I won't. But one I will mention is the fritillary butterfly. The caterpillar of the fritillary, they only eat the leaves of violets. And where I live, if you don't pay a whole lot of attention to keeping your lawn pristine, you may see that you get the little purple violets popping up in your lawn. And some people think of those as a weed and try to get rid of them. I would just encourage you to leave those violets so that maybe you might be able to host some fritillary butterflies in your yard. And then, if you're thinking about adding native plants to your garden, add a milkweed. Any of our native milkweed species will support monarch butterflies. And that brings me to another concept in our gardens and in ecology, and that's keystone species. And these are plants or animals in an ecosystem that sort of disproportionately impact the ecosystem. So there's a lot of other animals or other species that depend on that one particular thing. A really great example in North America are the beaver, and they are little ecosystem engineers. They create wetlands, and then those wetlands end up supporting thousands of species of plants and animals. So they're really, really important little guys. In our gardens, oak trees play that role, and a lot of other plants do as well. And oak trees in my area, the bur oak can support over 500 different species of butterfly and moth caterpillars. That's pretty amazing. And in fact, a lot of our native butterflies and moths, their caterpillars eat the leaves of our native trees. So if you can add an oak or a native black cherry or a native willow or the birches, those are all going to be really good at supporting a lot of different species. And again, it's because these plants and animals co-evolved with each other in a specific location over very long periods of time. So they get these really important relationships. And in order for everybody to keep going, we need those keystone species. So hopefully I've convinced you to add a few native plants to your home garden. And the next question is usually, where can I buy these species? And I would check your local conservation organizations and forest preserves. Very often they will, as fundraisers, hold native plant sales. Typically in my area, they're all going to be in spring in the month of May. So it's a very busy time of year, but that's when we're getting our gardens growing here. But if you don't have that in your area, you can do an internet search to see if you've got something close by, a local native plant nursery. And where I live, I'm very lucky. We have a few different companies, native plant nurseries, that will do mail order. So I can go on their websites. I can use their website as a resource to learn about individual native plant species. I can order those plants and they'll ship them to my house, which is amazing. So here in Illinois, we have Possibility Place Nursery. They only sell plants. So they'll sell, grasses, wildflowers, shrubs, trees. And they're a great resource. In the upper Midwest here in Minnesota is Prairie Moon Nursery. And you can buy plants and seeds from them. And again, future videos, we're going to talk a lot about you know, how you can more affordably grow your own plants from seed. And then Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin also sells plants and seeds. These next two slides, I want to share my top 10, my favorite native plants for a variety of reasons. They're not in any sort of order. They're just kind of how I found the pictures in my files. I find they're all pretty important, but some of my favorites that I like to use in my garden, wild false indigo, a bur oak. Again, oaks are really important. Bee balm, the Monarda fistulosa, supports a lot of pollinators, super easy to grow and just beautiful. It starts blooming around the 4th of July where I live, so I call it nature's fireworks. We have a lot of native sedges. I just feel like sedges are a powerhouse in the garden. They do a lot of work at, keeping the ecosystem, garden weed free by planting, the sedges in clumps and then planting your flowers in between those clumps. Butterfly milkweed is one of my favorite milkweeds. It doesn't get totally out of control, and there's not very many other native plants with orange flowers. They're just a real striking plant to have in the garden, and they support monarch caterpillars. 6 through 10, again, in no particular order. I like to have something blooming through all the seasons, so I wanted to make sure I included a fall bloomer, the blue-stemmed goldenrod. Not the best picture of it from my garden, but I love those long stems. They're arching with those tiny clusters of yellow flowers. They bloom in the fall. Pollinators grow crazy for them. And it's pretty shade tolerant. And so I get a pop of color in some shady areas. New Jersey tea is one of my favorite native shrubs. It gets about 3 feet tall. It gets these clusters of white flowers that pollinators really love. And that's really nice. I've got it, as you can see, up against the foundation along a walkway. And it does spill out a little bit onto the sidewalk, but I make little supports that kind of push it back in, and it does nicely there. Redbud is a great understory tree. So if you've got, an area with a little bit of shade and they start blooming really early in the spring before they get their leaves, they're just stunning. And then they're also an incredibly important food source for bumblebee queens as they emerge from hibernation to have food and resources right after they get out of a long winter's nap. Wild ginger there, number 9, is a great ground cover, and it spreads moderately fast in my yard, but it tolerates shade. And if you're looking for something maybe underneath a tree in your yard that you don't want to mess with trying to mow under there, which is, I applaud that. I love wild ginger for that. It's pretty low growing and just gorgeous. And then not the best picture. I'm going to try and get a better picture in the summer. But behind that butterfly milkweed is a grass, a native grass called prairie dropseed. Love using it in a residential garden. It doesn't get very big, but it kind of has this sort of clumping fountain-like grass appearance. And it's a great backdrop for native plants. Like in my yard, again, not the best angle, but I've got this row of prairie dropseed, and then I planted butterfly milkweed in front of it, so that orange just pops. And the grass covers the soil nicely and prevents weeds. A few of my other favorite resources, really any book by Dr. Doug Tallamy. If you do an internet search, you'll find a bunch of his books. There's got a great book on oaks. He's Nature's Best Hope. His most recent one is called How Can I Help? It's a really great compilation of questions that he's gotten over the years about native plants, native plant landscaping, the impacts of native plants, the importance of them. And it's all kind of condensed from his years of study. He's a professor at a university. And then he, along with some other folks, started a group called the Homegrown National Park. I would recommend you do a Google search on that or some internet search. Wild ones are, they have a national and then a bunch of local chapters. So you might be able to find a local wild ones chapter near you. It's a great way to learn a ton of stuff about native plants, native plant landscaping, get together with folks who are interested in the same topic as you. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. really great resource on all things related to invertebrates, insects and all the fun little things there and the important role they play and how we can better support them. Prairie Moon Nursery's website is a great resource for learning about really specific things about each individual native plant species that you may want to grow. Again, their focus is mostly on Midwest species, but it tells you how tall a plant's going to get, when's it going to bloom, what kind of soil conditions, what kind of sun conditions. Really great website. And most states will have a native plant society. I would recommend checking into your states, just do an internet search for native plant society. And then another really great scientist and author, Heather Holm, has a lot of books out. She focuses a lot on bees and wasps and pollinators, and has a lot of great information on her website about a concept garden called a soft landing. And I'll let you go investigate there. I'm going to try and put as many links in the description as I can. But I encourage you to just start researching, start checking things out locally. And we'll end with a lovely little picture of some spiderwort in my yard. When I took the picture, I didn't have my glasses on. I just was like, oh, the spiderwort's blooming. It looks so pretty. And I did a real zoomed in shot, and then I realized, oh, wow, there's a slug there. There's an insect coming up from underneath the petal. One of my favorite flowers here. It blooms in June into July, and then it'll take a little break, and sometimes I get another little bloom later in the fall. This year I had it bloom again in November because we had such nice weather. So thank you for joining me, and we'll see you through the garden gate the next time.